You're 14 years old, and you've just been told that tomorrow you'll be married to someone you've never met. Your future depends entirely on whether you can survive your wedding night, produce an heir within a year, and navigate a household where one wrong move could mean poison in your soup or a mysterious fall down the stairs. Welcome to Medieval Marriage, the deadliest game ever invented, where the rules were rigged against you from birth and the house always wins. But here's the thing that will haunt you. This wasn't gambling with your life, this was your life. What I'm about to tell you will shatter every romantic notion you've ever had about medieval times. This isn't some dramatic exaggeration for effect. This is the cold, calculated reality of a system so brutal that modern horror movies couldn't do it justice. Medieval marriage wasn't just dangerous. It was a sophisticated death trap designed to eliminate the weak, exploit the vulnerable, and consolidate power in the hands of those ruthless enough to play by rules written in blood. Before we dive into this nightmare, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to learn isn't just history. It's a masterclass in human cruelty that makes modern dating apps look like paradise. Picture this deadly game board. The moment you're born, your entire future is being decided by people who view you as a playing piece rather than a human being. Your parents aren't planning your education or your career. They're calculating your market value and strategizing about which family alliance will bring them the most benefit. You don't know it yet, but you're already dead in this game. You just haven't stopped breathing. The rules of medieval marriage were simple and terrifying. Survive or die. There was no middle ground, no participation trophy, no second chances. From the moment you entered a marriage contract, you were trapped in a life or death scenario where your survival depended on factors completely beyond your control. Your spouse's mental stability, your in-laws' political ambitions, your ability to produce male heirs, even the weather during harvest season. Any of these could determine whether you lived to see your next birthday. Let me introduce you to the players in this deadly game. First, there were the parents, your own parents, who would sell you to the highest bidder without a second thought. These weren't loving caregivers trying to secure your happiness. They were cold-blooded strategists who viewed their children as assets to be liquidated at the optimal moment. Your mother, who might have suffered through the same system, would often be the one to negotiate the terms of your doom with chilling efficiency. Then there were your future in-laws, who saw you as either an opportunity or a threat to their family's power. If you brought wealth and useful connections, you might survive long enough to prove your value. If you represented a political liability or failed to meet their expectations, you could expect your food to start tasting strange or your bedroom to develop dangerous architectural problems. Your spouse was perhaps the most unpredictable player in this game. They might be a terrified child like yourself, an abusive adult who saw marriage as a license to torture, or a calculating manipulator who would use you until you were no longer useful. You had no way of knowing which type you'd get until it was too late to escape. But the deadliest player of all was the system itself, a web of laws, customs, and social expectations designed to trap you in increasingly dangerous situations while providing your tormentors with complete legal protection. Medieval law didn't just permit the abuse of wives and children, it actively encouraged it as a necessary tool for maintaining order. Now let's talk about the opening moves in this deadly game. The marriage negotiations were conducted like military campaigns, with families gathering intelligence about potential targets, identifying weaknesses to exploit, and planning strategies to maximize their gains while minimizing their risks. Your life expectancy, your family's financial vulnerability, your potential for producing heirs, everything was calculated and factored into the decision to destroy your future. The betrothal ceremony was essentially a public announcement of your doom. Families would gather to witness the signing of contracts that legally bound you to a fate you had no voice in choosing. The celebration wasn't about your happiness. It was about the successful completion of a business transaction that would likely result in your death within a few years. But here's where the game gets truly diabolical: the waiting period between betrothal and marriage. This wasn't a romantic courtship period. It was a psychological torture designed to break your spirit before the real suffering began. You would spend months or even years knowing exactly when and how your life would end, powerless to change it, watching your family celebrate the deal they'd made at your expense. The wedding day itself was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. You were dressed up like a sacrifice, paraded in front of witnesses who were there to ensure you couldn't escape, and formally handed over to strangers who now owned every aspect of your existence. The ceremony wasn't a celebration of love. It was a public execution disguised as a party. Let me tell you about Isabella of Angoulême, who was 12 years old when she was married to King John of England in 1200. She had been previously betrothed to Hugh IX of Lusignan, but John literally kidnapped her on her way to her first wedding and forced her to marry him instead. This wasn't seen as a crime. It was considered a brilliant political move. Isabella spent her wedding night terrified and confused, not understanding why her original fiancé's family was now trying to kill her or why her new husband seemed to enjoy her fear. The wedding night was where the game claimed its first victims. Many young brides simply died from the trauma of their first sexual experience. Medieval physicians noted the phenomenon, but attributed it to weak constitutions rather than the obvious reality that children's bodies weren't designed to survive adult sexual violence. Those who survived the wedding night often suffered internal injuries that would kill them slowly over the following months, but physical survival of the wedding night was just the first level of this deadly game. The real challenge was navigating the complex web of jealousy, paranoia, and violence that defined medieval household politics. Your new family members weren't just indifferent to your welfare, they were actively plotting against you. Every meal was potentially poisoned, every staircase was potentially sabotaged, every seemingly friendly conversation was potentially gathering information to use against you later. The pressure to produce heirs created the next deadly challenge. Medieval wives who failed to become pregnant within the first year of marriage faced escalating threats to their survival. They might be subjected to increasingly dangerous fertility treatments involving toxic substances, painful procedures, and psychological torture. If they continued to fail to conceive, they could expect to be divorced, abandoned, or murdered to make way for a more fertile replacement. Pregnancy offered no safety in this deadly game. In fact, it often made the situation more dangerous. Pregnant wives became valuable breeding stock rather than human beings, subjected to constant monitoring and control that bordered on imprisonment. They were forbidden from making any decisions about their own care, forced to follow medieval medical advice that was often lethal, and treated like livestock being prepared for slaughter. The maternal mortality rate in medieval times was astronomical, but it wasn't just due to poor medical knowledge. Many deaths that appeared to be childbirth complications were actually murders disguised as natural causes. A wife who had produced a male heir might be killed to prevent her from claiming any inheritance rights on behalf of her son. A wife who had only produced daughters might be eliminated to make room for a new wife who might deliver male heirs. Let me introduce you to Marguerite of France, who was married to Edward III of England's son Edward in 1299. She was 20 years old and considered ancient by medieval standards for a first marriage. She had survived longer than most because her previous marriage negotiations had fallen through due to political complications, but her advanced age made her a high-risk player in the marriage game. She was expected to prove her fertility immediately, and when her first pregnancy ended in a miscarriage, she faced immediate threats to her position and her life. The households where these deadly games played out were essentially war zones disguised as homes. Medieval family dynamics were characterized by constant suspicion, shifting alliances, and the ever-present threat of violence. Your mother-in-law might be your greatest enemy, plotting your destruction to advance her own son's interests. Your sister-in-law might be your competitor for resources, willing to poison you to secure her own position. Even the servants were potential threats, as they could be bribed or coerced into participating in plots against you. The legal system was designed to ensure that victims of this deadly game had no recourse and no escape. Women had no legal rights that couldn't be overridden by their male relatives. They couldn't own property, couldn't make contracts, couldn't seek legal protection, and couldn't even testify in court without male permission. The law didn't just fail to protect them, it actively enabled their abuse and murder. Divorce was virtually impossible, but even if you somehow managed to escape your marriage, you would likely find yourself in an even more dangerous situation. Divorced women were social outcasts with no legal protection and no means of support. They were easy targets for violence, exploitation, and further abuse. Many divorced women were forced into prostitution or ended up dying alone and destitute. The economic aspects of this deadly game were particularly cruel. Wives were expected to contribute their dowries to their husbands' families, effectively paying for their own imprisonment and abuse. If they failed to bring sufficient wealth to the marriage, they could expect their treatment to reflect their diminished value. Poor wives were disposable. Wealthy wives were valuable enough to keep alive, but only as long as their money lasted. The international nature of medieval marriage made the game even more deadly. Wives were often shipped to foreign countries where they didn't speak the language, understand the customs, or have any allies. They were completely isolated and vulnerable, making them easy targets for abuse and murder. If they died under suspicious circumstances, there was rarely any investigation, since they had no family nearby to demand justice. The psychological torture aspect of this deadly game was perhaps the most sophisticated element. Medieval families understood that breaking a person's spirit was often more effective than simply killing them outright. They developed elaborate systems of emotional abuse designed to make their victims compliant and submissive. Wives were subjected to constant criticism, humiliation, and threats designed to convince them that resistance was futile. The religious justification for this system made it even more insidious. The church taught that suffering in marriage was spiritually beneficial, and that women who died as a result of their marital duties were essentially martyrs who would be rewarded in the afterlife. This religious framework made it almost impossible for victims to seek help or even to understand that what was happening to them was wrong. But here's the most chilling aspect of this deadly game. It was designed to be hereditary. Children who survived this system were taught to perpetuate it. Girls who managed to live through their own marriages often became the mothers-in-law who tormented the next generation of victims. Boys who witnessed the abuse of their mothers learned to view women as disposable property. The trauma was passed down through generations, creating an endless cycle of violence and death. The record-keeping from this period reveals the cold calculation behind these deadly games. Families maintained detailed ledgers tracking their investments in marriages, including expected returns, actual profits, and acceptable losses when wives died prematurely. These documents read like business reports from a slaughterhouse, with clinical notations about human lives reduced to numbers on a balance sheet. The survival strategies developed by those trapped in this system were heartbreaking and often futile. Some women tried to make themselves indispensable by becoming expert household managers or developing valuable skills. Others attempted to forge alliances with powerful family members who might protect them. Many simply tried to become invisible, hoping that if they didn't draw attention to themselves, they might survive a little longer. The medical establishment was complicit in this deadly game, providing scientific justification for the systematic abuse and murder of wives. Medieval physicians wrote elaborate treatises explaining why women were naturally inferior, inherently unstable, and biologically designed to be controlled by men. These medical opinions provided legal and social cover for abuse that might otherwise have been questioned. The cultural artifacts that survive from this period tell the story in heartbreaking detail. Medieval art often depicts married women looking terrified, exhausted, or resigned to their fate. The literature from this era is filled with references to the brief lives of wives and the sorrows of the marriage bed. Even medieval people seemed to understand that what they were doing was monstrous, but the system was too profitable to abandon. Let me tell you about Joan of Kent, who was married 3 times before she was 30 years old. Her first husband died under mysterious circumstances after she had been married for less than 2 years. Her second marriage was annulled when it was discovered that her first marriage had been arranged illegally, making her a bigamist. Her third marriage was to Edward the Black Prince, but only after she had survived assassination attempts by both her previous in-laws, who viewed her continued existence as a threat to their interests. The international diplomatic implications of these deadly games were staggering. Wars were fought over marriage contracts, and the survival or death of individual wives could determine the fate of entire kingdoms. A young queen's ability to produce male heirs could prevent or trigger international conflicts. The pressure on these women was so intense that many developed what medieval observers called royal madness, a condition we would now recognize as severe stress-related mental illness. The economic calculations behind these deadly games were coldly rational from the family's perspective. A wife who died after producing a male heir was considered a successful investment. A wife who died childless was a financial loss, but one that could be offset by remarrying quickly and trying again with a new victim. The human cost was never factored into these calculations. The seasonal patterns of death among medieval wives reveal the systematic nature of this violence. Deaths spiked during certain times of year when families needed to renegotiate political alliances or when inheritance laws made it profitable to eliminate inconvenient wives. These weren't random tragedies. They were carefully timed murders disguised as natural deaths. But here's a reality check that might surprise you. Some women did manage to win this deadly game, but only by becoming as ruthless as their tormentors. They learned to play the system, eliminating their enemies before they could be eliminated themselves. These survivor queens often became the most feared and powerful women of their era, but at the cost of their humanity and any chance of genuine happiness. The legacy of this system extended far beyond the Middle Ages. The attitudes and practices that made medieval marriage so deadly persisted in various forms for centuries afterward. Some elements of this deadly game can still be seen in modern societies where women are treated as property, and marriage is viewed primarily as an economic transaction rather than an emotional partnership. The psychological profiles of the perpetrators reveal the systematic nature of this violence. Medieval men weren't necessarily monsters by nature. They were products of a system that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. They were taught from childhood that women were expendable resources rather than human beings, and they internalized these beliefs so completely that they could torture and kill their wives without experiencing guilt or remorse. The documentation of resistance efforts shows that not all victims went quietly to their deaths. Some medieval women developed elaborate networks of mutual support, sharing information about dangerous families and warning each other about threats. They created coded languages to communicate safely and developed ingenious methods of protecting themselves and their children. But these resistance efforts were constantly discovered and brutally suppressed. So there you have it, medieval marriage as it really was. Not a romantic institution or a pathway to happiness, but a deadly game designed to eliminate the weak and concentrate power in the hands of the ruthless. This wasn't love or companionship or mutual support. This was systematic human sacrifice disguised as social order, where your life was forfeit from the moment you were born into a world that viewed you as a playing piece rather than a person. The next time someone talks about traditional marriage or romanticizes the past, remember what tradition actually looked like. Remember the millions of people who died in this deadly game, not because they were unlucky or unprepared, but because they were born into a system designed to kill them. Their deaths weren't tragic accidents. They were the intended outcome of a game where survival was never really an option. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go appreciate the fact that I can choose my own spouse, negotiate my own marriage terms, and expect to survive my wedding night without requiring a food taster or a bodyguard. If this exploration of history's deadliest game has left you as horrified as it should, make sure you subscribe for more historical truths that will make you grateful to be alive in an era where marriage is about love rather than survival. Because trust me, the more you learn about how our ancestors lived and died, the more you'll appreciate the freedoms we often take for granted.